Understanding Genesis, a series of programs for the entire family featuring many of the world's leading creationist speakers. They will answer your questions about creation and evolution and will demonstrate that the book of Genesis is reliable and vitally important.
Well, the last hour I had a chance to share with you some of the evidence of creation in biology, and I forgot to tell you that all of that evidence of creation was only good up until 1859. What happened in 1859? Well, as many of you know, that was the year that Darwin published the book, The Origin of Species. Many have claimed that The Origin of Species is second only to the Bible in its influence on human history, and some would put it first. Very famous historian of science, Will Durant, talked about the world being in a pagan era at the present time. He said our present pagan era began, and he didn't say miscellaneously in the mid-1800s or in the age of this or that. He said our present pagan era began in 1859 with the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. Up until that time, it was considered that a study of nature was a cure for atheism. Following on from Romans 1, the invisible things of God are so clearly seen in the things that have been made that people were without excuse. And what Darwin did in the eyes of many was give people an excuse, a way of explaining design without a designer. That Michael Denton that I mentioned, who's now a biochemist here in Sydney, he was interviewed, he and I both, on a television program I'll tell you about later. But in his interview, he was talking about the complexity of the living cell and how he wanted to believe in evolution, but the problem seemed so monumental. And then the interviewer asked him at one point, what do you think the real impact has been of evolution? And Dr. Denton paused and thoughtfully before the camera and said, I believe the real impact has been to make atheism possible, or at least respectable. And that does seem to be it. For many people, that was the end of the argument from design. Now we can explain all appearance of design without any reference to a designer, no reference to God at all. And that's why it's considered so influential that it removed God from civilized thought altogether. Well, as powerful and profound as the effect of Darwinism has been, the idea itself is astonishingly simple. Well, as you know, the concept is called natural selection, and often summarized in the two phrases, the struggle for survival and the survival of the fittest. And it's really a simple concept in conception. Darwin admits quite freely that he got the idea of natural selection from his observations of artificial selection. So in the England of the last century, and indeed around the world for many centuries, men have been using selective breeding to produce sheep and cattle and dogs and cats and goldfish and everything else. And one of the things that struck Darwin in particular were pigeons like this. This is the ordinary wild rock pigeon and so on that is found around statues and buildings in many parts of the world. And you can take this ordinary, common-looking bird like this and breed some that have a little crest on their head, and some with a big neck pouch, some with a great big tail fan like this, and also breed this little scrawny one if you really want to. And all of these things can be bred from this wild rock pigeon and right back to the wild rock pigeon. And so Darwin said if man can select and produce that much variety in a short period of time, perhaps nature can select as well and produce new varieties of living things. Well, is there any evidence that nature can select as well as man? And the answer is yes, there is. And most of you are very familiar, have heard at least somewhere along the line, about the most famous example of selection in nature, the peppered moth in the forests in England. And so back in the 1850s, if you imagine these two boxes here are photographs that were taken 100 years apart, back in the 1850s, the forests in central England were covered with a growth of lichen and so on, and it gave them kind of a mottled gray-white appearance. And during the day, a certain species of moth, Byston betullaria, would rest on the trunks of these trees. Well, as you look at the photograph there, how many members of this moth species do you see? How many see one? Okay. How many see two? How many see three? I've always wondered where that third one is. But I know there's two. Here's one here and here's one down here. You can just barely make it out, perhaps. This one here that seems kind of camouflaged. Well, presumably that's the way the birds saw it as well. So they could find and easily pick off the black moths for lunch and so on, and leave the white moth hidden and camouflaged. But then came the Industrial Revolution, and pollution, soot, and all of this kind of stuff literally drained down the trees during rain, and also the pollution killed off the lichen on the trees, so the trees appeared much darker in color, and 100 years later the dark moth was more camouflaged than the light one. And so there you have it, evolution going on today. That's actually the way it was explained to me in class. That's the way I taught it to my students. When I taught evolution, if anybody said, well, you know, if you believe in evolution, why can't you see it going on today? I'd say you can. Launch into the story of the peppered moth. Several times at universities, students have told me the profs have warned them, tomorrow we're going to get the best evidence for evolution, and spend the whole hour on the details of the peppered moth here. And yet what I just told you is true. The peppered moth does demonstrate natural selection. Okay, thanks to a competition occurring in nature, the percentage of moth changed from 98% light back in the 1850s to 98% dark in the 1950s. Natural selection, yes. Evolution, no. Now, that's an important distinction. We do have evidence that Darwin was right about the concept of natural selection, at least in a limited way. We have no evidence at all that Darwin was right about the concept of evolution. The concept of evolution is not about a change from mostly dark-colored moth to a mostly light-colored moth, is it? It's about a change of one kind of organism to another, amoeba to man, fish to philosopher, as the title of another book put it, and so on. Do we see any evidence at all of a change from one kind of life to another in the peppered moth story? Not at all. What do you have at the start of the observations? Moth, species Bison betullaria, dark and light forms. What do you have 100 years later? Moth, species Bison betullaria, dark and light forms. The moth didn't change at all. The only thing that changed was the environment in which the moth lived and the percentages of the two different color forms that survived. That was all. No change from one kind of life to another anywhere in the picture. As a matter of fact, that concept of natural selection was not the work of Charles Darwin. That concept of natural selection was published 24 years before Darwin did by a fellow Englishman, Edward Blyth. But Blyth was a creationist. And so Blyth made no more out of natural selection than you could actually observe scientifically. He recognized quite correctly, in our world we do have a struggle for survival. There is death and disease and disaster. Is that the way God created the world to begin with? Not at all. That's not God's means of creation, as Ken showed so clearly this morning. Instead, what we are seeing here is evidence of the fall, a corruption of the created order, the subjection to futility and a bondage to decay and so on. That's what we see here. There is really struggle going on in the world at the present time. And so to the creationist Edward Blyth, natural selection was a real phenomenon now. It hadn't always been going on. It wouldn't always be going on. But it was real right now, and it helped explain how and where living things survived as they multiplied and filled the earth after the fall and after the flood. So it really isn't natural selection at all that attracted attention. Natural selection was published as a scientific theory by creationists in terms of the fall and the flood and so on already earlier. What Darwin did was make natural selection the basis of a new religion, a religion without revelation. That was the impact. Well, when you get to that, now we're talking about something different. Is it possible that if you let natural selection operate long enough, that it really would make an evolutionary change, something amoeba to man, not just moth to moth and so on? Well, what we're talking about there is a phenomenon of extrapolation, following a trend to its logical conclusion. Then, of course, extrapolation is a normal scientific or everyday endeavor. If we talk about the population of the world back in 1800, 1850, 1900, and so on, you can run a graph and extrapolate, figure out what the population is likely to be in 1990 and 2000, 2010, and so on. And yet, every time you extrapolate, what? You have to watch for limits. Logical limits to the extrapolation. We know the population of the earth will never reach 50 quintillion. There's just not that much space to go around. So extrapolation is okay as long as you know the limits in the boundary conditions. I'm sorry to use this particular example, but since it's on the chart. A few years ago, in fact, several years ago, after I got out of college, college is not enormously good for your health. And I realized that I'd run down a bit. And I was reading the Reader's Digest, you know, and there was this thing in there about jogging, you know, and fitness and all that. And I said, you know, I really ought to start getting back in shape. And so they had this chart, you know, where you ought to begin. I thought, well, should I go? And so I went out and decided to jog a mile. See, over here it's not as bad. You only have to jog a kilometer. But that I had to go a whole mile. And so I set off, and believe it or not, I am embarrassed about this. I think I can swim faster than this, but it took me 12 minutes to jog, or should I say slog, a mile. I thought you could crawl faster than that. But after a week of ardent, persistent effort, I was down to 11 minutes. Another week, I was down to 10 minutes. Then 9 minutes, then 8 minutes, then 7 minutes, 6 minutes, 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes? No. There are some limits in there, are there? I'm not going to tell you where I reached my limit. But if there were no limits, you know, and you were running out of time, you could jog and make up time, add minutes to your life and so on. But instead, of course, there are limits to this process of extrapolation. So if we talk about extrapolating moth to moth to molecules to man, are there any kind of limits that we run into? And there are indeed. Scientifically, we can specify natural selection will go this far and no farther. One of the major limits on natural selection is the one we talked about last hour, the marvelous fit of living things to their environment. The fact that many parts have to work together, for instance, in the woodpecker, before he can develop that ability to drill, before he can develop that ability to chase beetles with a long, sticky tongue. Darwin was very much aware of that limit. And as I mentioned, called it difficulties with the theory, that you can't step by step build up something that has to have many parts working together at the same time. Perhaps even more importantly, the one thing that Darwin's book called Origin of Species never dealt with was the origin of species, where the new traits came from in the first place. After all, natural selection can select something that exists already. It can't make something that doesn't exist. You have to have it there before you can select it. Take a look at one of Darwin's famous examples, these finches on the Galapagos Islands, about 600 miles west of South America on the equator. How did Darwin explain the origin of these birds with the different sizes of bills? Some had bills with large bills like this for crushing seeds. Some had little bills for catching insects and so on. How did Darwin explain it? Exactly the same way a creationist would. He said, as I was sailing around the South American mainland, investigating things there, I saw finches with a variety of beak types. He says, let me imagine that some of these birds were caught on a mat of vegetation that was washed out in a storm. And as they got to these islands, what did he start with again? He started with the birds with a variety of finch types, not explaining their origin, but simply how and where they survived. Those birds that had the large seeds could survive on the islands where seeds were an abundant food source. It would be very difficult to catch insects and move rapidly enough to do that. On other islands where insects were a major food source, the ones with the small bills survived and so on. Again, an idea that a creationist would have accepted many, many years before Darwin published that same idea. So again, it helps explain how and where things survive, but not how they originate. You know what Darwin used to explain how traits originate? Where did the different sizes of bills come from in the first place? Where did the giraffe get its long neck? A particular example. It wasn't natural selection. Natural selection will save it, but something else has to originate it. For origin, Darwin, like Lamarck, believed in pangenesis, use and disuse, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And this was a particular example Darwin used. How did the giraffe get its long neck? It started with a short-necked animal grazing grass on the African prairie in a drought. Dried up the grass and so on. There wasn't anything left to eat. And some of these animals began to stretch their necks, reaching for leaves in the trees. And as they stretched their necks, the neck got longer. Okay, well, there's some limits on that. But even more importantly, his idea was that after they stretched their neck, then they passed on the long neck to their offspring. Now, that's the part that doesn't seem to work at all. But the idea back then was, at the time of reproduction, each organ produced pangenes that flowed through the blood down to the reproductive organs and got passed on to the next generation. So the next generation would start with a longer neck. In fact, this was widely believed. It wasn't just Darwin who believed this. Darwin did carry it to some extremes, that you know, just by effort you could make things happen. And he also used it in the most unusual way. The pangenes would be in the male reproductive system. They would be absorbed into the body of the female. And so as the years went by, there would be more and more male pangenes and so. And so this is what Darwin used to explain why wives grew to resemble her husband as the years went by. That's how strongly he believed in what's now, of course, a totally discarded and false idea of heredity. The modern evolution, but this was the one, by the way, that attracted a lot of attention because it looked like just effort. You could make things evolve better and better just by effort. That's why Darwin wanted to dedicate his book, Das Kapital, to Darwin. How do you make perfect people? Make the perfect society, and people automatically evolve to fit it. And so it gave evolution a kind of optimism. Modern evolutionary thinking is called neo-Darwinian. Because something new has been added. Selection is still retained, but now we have mutations taking the place of use and disuse. Just sheer chance. Blind random processes. How did the giraffe get its long neck? No particular reason. An animal is just wandering around on the prairie. Zots, it gets hit by that cosmic ray that made the woodpecker too. Here it got hit by this something, and a long neck sprouts. And, and then if everybody else, if the grass is green down there, he probably dies because giraffes have a terrible time bending over to eat things on the ground. They have to eat things out of the top. In fact, every time a giraffe bends down to take a drink of water, by the way, if you've ever seen them at the zoo, they get down on their knees and spend a lot of times and arc their big neck down like that. And they have to do it carefully because when they bend down to take a drink, the heart's way up here, about 14 feet above the brain. And they're in danger of literally blowing their brains out from blood pressure. If there wasn't a whole series of devices to drop the blood pressure like that, that would be it. There'd be one massive cerebral hemorrhage, and there'd be one giraffe, one short period. When they get up, by the way, and they put the neck back up there, then what's the problem? They're in danger of fainting and passing out. So they have to have auxiliary pumps. So again, these are one of those difficulties with the theory, how you get all of that together at the same time. In the modern scientist, in a sense, is a step down from Darwin, says, sure enough, it isn't effort. It's just blind chance, just random mutations. And, of course, it often takes a lot of them together at the same time. Well, mutations are real. They really do occur. These are some fruit flies that are used in genetics experiments all the time. And thanks to radiation, the usual cause of mutation, some of these have split apart dicate wings, some curled wings, vestigial, rudimentary wings, miniature, screw, cross, veinless cut. Mutations have done almost everything to fruit fly wings except improve them. You do get a lot of variation from mutation, from radiation damage and so. Mutations, yes. Evolution, no. And so keep that in mind because a lot of times evolutionists thrive on partial knowledge. And so they get you believing that mutations occur, and they can prove mutations occur. And they say mutations are what makes evolution, and you're kind of led along. Oh, no. Mutations, yes, they really do occur. Evolution, no. Again, we run into some very definite limits that tell us just how far we can go with mutations. One of these definite limits are the mathematical arguments. Mutations are relatively rare things. They occur about once in every 10 million duplications of DNA. In fact, even in our fallen world, there's such a fantastic testimony to God's creativity. The error rate in copying the entire genetic code is so vastly superior to any machine ever invented by man that it's just phenomenal. Many engineers have talked about, even if you could make a robot that could make other robots, that the error rate so far in the electronic industry is so high that within a few generations there'd be so many errors the whole things would eliminate themselves. And yet God created living things to multiply faithfully after their kind that even in spite of mutations, the errors are so corrected and so on that things continue. The chance of adding up mutations in a row, Huxley put it this way, the odds of getting a horse are a 1 followed by 3 million zeros. A couple of scientists in England, Huxley and Wickramasinghe, studied the probability of just by mutations, even though it wouldn't work at all, just by mutations, of getting a living cell. And their conclusion was just to get one single cell would be equal to 1 in a 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. Well, in a universe that was 5 billion years old with 10 to the 80th atoms, anything beyond 10 to the minus 50 is completely impossible. And here we're talking about 10 to the minus 40,000. Their conclusion? There must be a God. Isn't that interesting? And these two gentlemen have the distinction of being the world's leading agnostic creationists. They recognize, simply in terms of the scientific evidence, that there must be a creator. There must be some kind of creative agency. Blind chance could not have brought this world into being. Wickramasinghe said he was surprised at that. He was a Buddhist. He wasn't expecting to find a God of creation. And Hoyle calls himself an agnostic. He wasn't expecting to find God. But just on the basis of the odds alone, there must be some kind of creative agent. In fact, Hoyle put it this way: the odds of getting life on a roll of the molecular dice would be like a tornado, a giant windstorm, sweeping through a junkyard and putting together a Qantas 747 from the parts therein. And he just laughs and says he's surprised any scientist would bet on odds like that. But again, Skin says belief in evolution can accomplish miracles, even if evolution can't. Well, that's just one problem. More serious is the fact that mutations are going in the wrong way as far as evolution is concerned. We ordinarily recognize mutations have occurred by the diseases, defects, and abnormalities that result from them. One of the side effects of mutation is often lowering lifespan. That may be one reason, indeed, that the lifespans begin to drop off after the flood. As Noah and his family began to multiply over the earth again, seemed logical that there would be an increase in the mutation rate from the disappearance of the vapor canopy. And now with just such a small group of people and so on, as they begin to migrate over the world, the mutations that occurred in them would be brought out by the fact there was such a small group of people, and they would have to marry closely to one another. Mutations would not be a problem at all originally. When Cain had to marry a sister and so on, that would be no problem at all, because God had created them without these defects, and there wouldn't be any problem. Nowadays, it's unwise to marry someone closely related to you, because, believe it or not, we have over 2,000 mutational disorders as human beings. And it's only by common consent that we sort of agree to call each other normal. We don't know what normal really is. They're really, at the present time, in the little town of Ferraro, Italy, I don't know whether that's where they make Ferraris or not, but the little town of Ferraro, Italy, they actually post on the public square lists the results of tests, because thalassemia, a certain kind of blood disease, is so common there, but before you date someone seriously and consider marriage, you ought to check out whether or not they're a carrier or have this and so on. It's really that serious. At the present time, genetic burden, mutational load is so great that about 1% of all human children born are going to require some professional help or need some professional help as a result of genetic defect. Genetically, by the way, that means that we're carrying about 10% of our genes are really in trouble. The only reason we can survive is that we have two sets of genes. One set we inherit from our mother, one set we inherit from our father. If we could see the two sets separately, we'd be horrified at what a wreck we are. But usually the defects don't quite match up, and so we come out sort of normal, as I mentioned. Once in a while, you see an organism that develops from just the egg cell without any fertilization. And here was a turkey that was born one time from an unfertilized egg, and you get to see what mutations have done to animal species. The feathers were missing in patches, the head wobbled from side to side from a neurological disorder. It was so easily subject to disease it had to be transferred to a germ-free chamber. And if it weren't for those two sets of chromosomes, that would be you and I. And so mutations are going in the wrong way as far as evolution is concerned. They're making things worse, not better at all. In fact, one of the things you can often ask is, well, give me an example of a good mutation. You can ask an evolutionist that. It wouldn't really matter if they came up with 1 or 2 or 3 or not, because it would be drowned in the sea of harmful changes. Everybody knows harmful changes occur at a much greater rate than anything helpful. But you know what? When I've asked people at universities, well, give me an example of a beneficial change, the only example I've ever gotten at a university, and it's the same example several times, sickle cell anemia. Now, how's that sound for a beneficial mutation? You want to go out and stand in the sun, see if that can happen to you too? And it's a blood disease. And it's a blood disease that actually, it changes that little molecule hemoglobin in red blood cells, so that under low oxygen tension around the red blood cells, this shape will form a sickle shape, and they'll get caught and snagged in the capillaries and rupture and spill the hemoglobin and so on. It's a fatal disease. What could be good about that? Well, there's a little disease organism, a protozoan parasite that causes malaria that eats hemoglobin. And it doesn't like sickle cell hemoglobin. So if you've got this bad hemoglobin, malaria will leave you alone. So it's not that sickle cell anemia is so good, it's just less bad than malaria is. But again, you can calculate exactly how far you can go with that. And you get a balance between death rate from malaria and death rate from sickle cell anemia. In fact, the gene can build up to a frequency of only 18% in the population, and its harmful effects are ended. And that ends the thing right there. Again, limited variation, not improvement at all. It was kind of a thrill, by the way. I guess it was just really last August that I was in Sydney for some lecture tours and spoke at the Institute for Technology there. The graduate students and the science staff, and gave them a whole lecture on genetic burden and the formulas that show, limitations, and got quite a good hearing. I was really pleased with both the profs and the students, that were intrigued by the creation arguments here. One of the books that you mentioned this morning that I have out is on heredity. I wrote it originally as an evolutionist. Later on, I rewrote it as a creationist, and my co-author was my major professor. And as we got ready to revise the book, now she's a Christian, but she's never really thought much about creation and evolution. And she said, I noticed every time in our book on heredity, every time we mention mutation, it's something bad. Says, don't you think we should put in the statement, well, we're here after all as a result of mutations? So that's when I had to tell her I'd become a creationist, and if we wanted to do that, I'd have to put in the other side. And she wasn't really too upset by that, but she didn't want to get involved in that much, and so we agreed, well, let's just put in an example of a good mutation. We couldn't find any. She taught at the University of Illinois Medical Center. She asked all over, and I asked all around, and so on. We couldn't find anything to put in. Neither one of us was willing to put in sickle cell anemia. And so mutations are simply going in the wrong direction as far as evolution is concerned. The logical extrapolation of mutation is what? Death and extinction. And you know who knows that better than anyone else? Francisco Ayala, the world's leading genetic evolutionist at the present time. I use his population genetics textbook in my population genetics class. The last chapter, what does the future hold? Well, here he's an evolutionist writing a book on evolution. You think, what does the future hold? Well, he'd be talking about how much grander everything's going to be, oranges this big around, and people so smart that you can't even design an IQ test for them, and just the wonders of evolution. No, the last chapter is how are we going to save ourselves from mutations? It says, can we escape governments actually taking control of the reproductive processes? Must we eliminate, and forbid certain people to reproduce? How are we going to save ourselves? He says, even wild species are being so hindered by mutational load, how can we hope to survive? Isn't that something? That's upward, onward progress in the evolutionary sense. And that's not the end of the story. Mutations can't produce evolution because of the mathematical problems. Mutations can't produce evolution because they're going the wrong way. And mutations can't produce evolution because, in a sense, they point back to creation. Now, what I mean by that is they require a prior act of creation. Mutations are mostly caused by radiation, but if radiation just hits water in the cell, that doesn't do anything. Mutation has to hit a gene that already exists. And so what's the most you can get from a mutation is just variation within kind, just a variation of a gene that already exists. Again, those poor fruit flies, scientists have been shoving them in X-ray tubes and hitting them with X-rays ever since the early 1900s. And they've got out of them, for instance, eyes. They used to have an eye color kind of a sepia brown. Well, now they've got orange-eyed flies and white-eyed flies and red-eyed flies and prune and apricot or a couple other eye colors. But every time the radiation hits an eye color gene, what do you get? Variation in eye color. You don't suddenly get a fruit fly with feathered wings or something like that. All you get is a variation in something that already exists. In that sense, they point back to creation. They can only change things that have already been created. But don't let me make a mistake here, get you thinking the wrong way. By no means am I saying mutations are God's means of creation. Not at all. The creations also point back to the corruption of the created order. Creation had to occur first, and then mutations. Of course, Paul wasn't thinking in genetic terms, but when he wrote in Romans 8:28 that the creation has been subjected to futility, it's a perfect description of mutation, subjected to the horrors of time and chance and just random changes that make things worse and not better. And so in that sense, creation has to occur first, and mutations have produced mostly harmful changes in God's original creation. So when it comes to change and what's happened since creation, we see that there are two concepts of change that are based on the ideas that we've talked about here. According to evolution, you see, change all started, and all of this kind of stuff began a long time ago, millions of years ago. We'll talk some more about that later, with organisms produced just by chance, a small gene pool that gradually expanded, more and more genes added over time until you get changes from amoeba to man finally. Transspeciation, real changes from one kind to another, from simple beginnings to complex results just by time and chance mutations culled out by the struggle for survival. Well, according to the creation concept, not at all. God created each of the separate kinds of life to multiply and fill the earth. And so if God created things to multiply and fill the earth, he created them with a large gene pool. So as they multiplied over the earth, they could indeed break up into specialized subgroups. And so again, this was a big help as far as Noah and the ark were concerned. And this is why, by the way, God brought the animals to Noah on the ark rather than let Noah choose them. For one thing, and they saved Noah a lot of hiking around. The other thing was God could see the genetic potential, so that the animals that he brought on the ark were the ones that had the genetic potential to multiply and refill the earth, an earth that God knew would have a different climate and so on than the earth did before the flood. And as they walked off the ark, they could specialize, break up into different specialized types. So you have bears getting off the ark, and as they migrate over the world, polar bears in one place, brown bears, grizzly bears, and so on in another place. So you start with large gene pools that divide and produce variation within kind. And of course, man can select some of that as well. An excellent example of this kind of change, the word over here is not evolution. The word over here would be entelechy in the Greek, and some of your professors can tell you a lot more about that than I can. But it means an unfolding of the potential that was there right from the beginning. Evolution is a word. It means adding on something new that was never there. Entelechy is an unfolding of what was there in the beginning, just like that human embryo. The whole plan is there. All of the features are there, right there in the egg cell. 6 feet of DNA all coiled up, give you everything. And then you just watch that plan unfold. Well, a good example of this in human beings, this kind of change and development, an unfolding of what God built in the beginning, would be human skin color, in variation in human skin color. Another example, by the way, would be singing voice. You know, when you think about Adam and Eve, what's one thing Adam and Eve couldn't do? Okay, sing in 4-part harmony, right? And yet there's, believe it or not, there's just one gene that controls your natural singing voice, and it has 3 expressions in man and has 3 expressions in woman. And so you can mix and match all these combinations and get some really tremendous variability, like the kind of singing that we were thrilled to experience in chapel this morning and so on. And so here you have that unfolding. In the case of skin color, okay, in the case of skin color here, one thing that may surprise you is that everybody in the whole world has exactly the same skin color. The only exception are albinos that because of mutation don't have any skin color at all. But anybody who has skin color has exactly the same skin color. It's a protein called melanin. So the only difference is the amount of skin color we have. It's kind of interesting by itself, isn't it? A lot has been made out of that, but we actually have the same exact skin color. And the only thing is the variation in the amount. Well, sometimes an evolutionist will ask you, well, how long would it take to get all the variation in the amount of skin color we have? If you have just Adam and Eve, just 2 people a few thousand years ago, or just Noah, even more recently, and just 8 people, how can you get all the variation in the amount of skin color? How long would that take? Answer, 1 generation. Not 1,000,000 years, not 1,000 years, not 100 years. 1 generation would be plenty. And many of you have done these genetic squares and so on. It now seems that there are 2 main genes, at least 2 main genes, that control the amount of skin color we have. Big and little a, we can call them, and big and little b. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us what skin color our first parents had, so we really don't know. From a design point of view, the simplest way to start is in the middle. That's where you get the most variation in the shortest period of time. If this started somewhere else, it would have taken 2 generations instead of 1, but that's the most you would take. Well, if our parents started off like this, in the middle like this, with medium skin color, then their children, Cain, Abel, Seth, and all their brothers and sisters and so on, some would have 4 capital letter genes in the darkest possible skin color. A brother or sister sitting across the table at dinner would have the lightest possible skin color, all little letter genes. 6 would have 2 genes in the same medium skin color their parents had. 4 would have a shade darker and 4 a shade lighter. And so it's as simple as that. In fact, this is the normal situation in India at the present time. So among the India Indians, sometimes I say it that way since I'm largely American Indian, some of the India Indians, and most of you met people from India, some are as dark as the darkest Africans. Some are as light as the lightest Norwegians. We knew a family while my father was in the Army from India, and their children showed the full range of skin color, you know, just the normal children, natural children in one family, and that's perfectly normal there. And yet you see what happens as people break up, and this is probably instigated originally at the Tower of Babel, as people break up into smaller groups and marry only within that small group. Notice what happens. If you have people that have very dark skin, marry people with only very dark skin, all they can pass on are large letter genes, and so generation after generation after generation, the children always have very dark skin. That would be some like many of the tribes in Africa. On the other hand, many of the peoples in Scandinavia, all they've got to pass on are little letter genes. So generation after generation after generation, it's all little letter genes. It's possible to get stuck in the middle. This kind of variation produces everything. But you can also have a medium skin color like this, 2 big A's and 2 little B's. And then what happens is the mother always passes on 1 big A and 1 little b. The father always passes on 1 big A, 1 little b. And so the children turn out with medium skin generation after generation like the Orientals and Polynesians. But then where people of different backgrounds get together again, as they do in the West Indies where the study was done, you're right back to the beginning. No more and no less variation than God built in right from the word go. And so what we see here is an unfolding of potential present right from the beginning. Dramatic illustration of that, I guess, at one particular point. It wasn't too many years ago that a Nigerian young lady and an English met and married and had children. And surprisingly enough, they had twin boys. That's not the surprise. The surprise is that one of the twin boys was just as light and fair-featured as his English father, and the other was just as dark as his Nigerian mother, and so on. Perfectly ordinary turn of events, as we know now, although that hasn't been known for so long. When it comes to our observations then of the world around about us, notice what we have. If you take a look at all the changes that occurred in the so-called evidence for creation and things like that and so on, what do you see? DDT-resistant flies. In evidence of evolution, flies became resistant to DDT? Not at all. They were resistant to DDT. The first time that pesticide was used, it killed only 98% of the flies. The other ones already had an alternate chemical pathway, and the poison was no problem to them. Same thing with bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. They didn't become resistant. They didn't evolve that resistance. They had it already in the beginning. In fact, you can pick up cultures of bacteria that have been maintained since before antibiotics were invented. And they're already resistant to that in low percentages. It's just like the peppered moth. You're not evolving something new. You're just increasing the frequency of one member of the species at the expense of others. And flu viruses, it keeps mutating so we can't come up with a vaccine against it, but it's always a flu virus, just a different strain of the same thing. Dogs, cats, corn, all the selective breeding, horses, Darwin's finches, fruit flies, none of that represents change between kinds. All of it represents variation or change within kinds. Well, now again, if the evidence is as clear and simple as I'm suggesting it is, then even scientists who are evolutionists ought to be able to recognize the limits of natural selection, the limits of mutation, and see that neither natural selection separately with mutations nor natural selection and mutations together, neither of them can explain evolution. And they do see that. Again, these people are kind of unhappy that I'm a creationist bringing this to their attention, but they're enough of a scientist to know that what I've said is absolutely true, even if they disagree with my biblical framework and belief. Well, here's a conference. As you can see, I got kind of excited about this particular article. But this is kind of a must reference if you want to look this up. This is Science, November 21st, 1980. And the Science and Nature are by far and away the two largest scientific publications in the world. And most scientists are very familiar with both of these publications. And so here, this was a meeting in Chicago in October of 1980 of geneticists and fossil experts, paleontologists from around the world getting together to review the evidence for evolution. I'll get back to that conference on the fossil side later. And I think one reason evolution continues to survive in science is the fragmentation, the specialization of science. You ask a fossil person, you know, well, have you got the evidence for evolution? Oh, no, I don't have it. It's a geneticist. He has it. You ask the geneticist, no, I don't have it. It's a paleontologist. Well, they got together in Chicago and they found out neither one of them had it. And this was a real eye-opener. And so this is written up in Science. And notice the central question of the Chicago Conference, not something discussed on the side, not just one person's paper. The reason these evolutionists got together from all over the world to talk about evolutionary theory, the reason they got together, this central question, was whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution. Now what's that? The mechanisms underlying microevolution, that's mutation and natural selection. If you ever hear the term microevolution, that's what is meant by it. It means mutations plus natural selection making evolution. Now I think anymore microevolution is a lousy term because it sort of sounds like a little bit of evolution, and if you wait long enough you get a lot of evolution. And that's what the scientists were looking at. Is that really true? If you take a little bit of evolution, mutation and natural selection, and wait long enough, will you get a lot of evolution, macroevolution? That was the question they were considering. The central question of the Chicago Conference was whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution. Now notice that. Mutation, natural selection. Notice something else. I already told you. Mutations, yes, mutations really do occur. Natural selection, yes, natural selection really does occur. A creationist thought of it 24 years before Darwin did. Those things are real, but can you make real evolution out of them? See, whether the mechanisms underlying mutation, natural selection can be, there's that word, isn't it, extrapolated. Can you logically extend our knowledge of mutations and natural selection to explain macroevolution? That's not moth to moth or fly to fly. That's molecules to a man, fish to philosopher, that kind of evolution. Can you really go from these little things, mutation and selection, to big evolution? And the writer says, at the risk of doing violence to the positions of some at the meeting, and the only one who really vocally objected was Ledyard Stebbins, said that, but neglecting him, the answer can be given as a clear, comma, capital N, no, no you can't. Isn't that interesting? Experts in evolution all over the world got together and said, Ken Ham is right. No, they didn't say it exactly that way. The creationists are right, but they said exactly the same thing creationists have been saying for dozens of years now for exactly the same reasons. Now, to be honest with you, they didn't give us any credit at all, but they did have to admit, no, you can't. The very same reasons that I presented to you, as I mentioned, I presented at universities, the genetics people will stay silent. You know, some of the students out there that heard this in school, they'll try to argue for mutation and selection. But the average university professor will kind of sit back because he knows that what I've said is true, and you can't go from mutation and selection to evolution. Well, that was a scientific summary, but it's not really all that difficult. And a few years ago, when creation was really quite a topic in America, the Wall Street Journal did a big central article on creation and evolution right down the middle of their newspaper. And in that, it was very fairly done. It was a real nice article and so on. And at one point, they interviewed a scientist at a major university, and he says, any farmer who practices selective breeding is practicing evolution. And then they interviewed a farmer. The farmer said, mister, when I cross pigs, I get pigs. I don't get horses. It could be another reason that evolution survives is people don't grow up on farms anymore. You don't see nature as it really is. So again, lots of evidence of variation, lots of evidence of variation within kind, but no changes from one kind to another. One fellow who summarized it as well as anybody is Garrett Hardin. Now, in spite of the fact Garrett Hardin is a major opponent of creation thinking, he edited a Scientific American book called 39 Steps to Biology, and it was all about the wonders of creation. And you know what the first chapter was called? Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. Fearfully and wonderfully made. In fact, I was going to mention that in connection with the human embryo. That's that phrase right there in Psalm 139. David talks about how God knew all about his life before it had even started, how God beheld his unformed substance, how God knit him together in his mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. In the second chapter, that was the first chapter, and he talked about things like the woodpecker and all of these marvelous adaptations. The second chapter, even though the man's an evolutionist, he wrote one called Nature's Challenges to Evolutionary Theory. And keep in mind, you don't really have to have a creationist come and talk to you about creation. All you have to do is go for a walk. Look through a microscope. Look through a telescope. The evidence of creation is everywhere. It's all around us. All we're doing is calling attention to the evidence that God has supplied. And so he talks about things like the woodpecker and about the cleaner fish and things like that. He says, these are only a few of the unsolved puzzles facing biologists committed to Darwinian theory. Then the last 3 lines in this article by this evolutionist: is the evolutionary framework wrong? Certainly that would be a legitimate question to take up in classes. But then he says, was Paley right? Well, I'm embarrassed to say when I first read that article, I didn't know who Paley was, but he explained it. William Paley was a thinker in the century before Darwin who argued the kind of design we see in the living world points clearly to a designer, not an impersonal force, but a personal creator God. Was Paley right about a personal creator God? Think about it. Think about it. And don't you wish school children around the world, in Australia and America and everywhere else, had the opportunity to think about it? And we want you to help give them the opportunity to think about it. And you need to do that yourself, don't you? If you're going to be an effective minister of the fantastic evangelical tool that God has given us in creation, then what do you need? It's what you mentioned in 1 Peter 3:15. Be ready to give a reason for the hope that's within you. Yet in gentleness and meekness, don't forget that part of it too. But you've got help. The things that we see in the world around about us don't make it hard to believe in God. Science doesn't make it hard to believe in God. Science makes it easy to believe in God. Some scientists are trying to make it hard to believe in God, but not science itself. What does Paul say? Or not Paul, what does David say in Psalm 19? The heavens declare the glory of God. Notice, they don't disguise it. They don't make it hard to see God. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows forth his handiwork. Again, it doesn't shovel it under a rug where you might miss it. I'm embarrassed to say when I first became a Christian, I was kind of proud of myself that I could see God even though all the evidence pointed in the other direction. I was awful. Forgive me, Lord. No, the evidence points us toward God. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech in the ordinary sense of the word, and yet their voice goes to the ends of the earth. And we hope we can help you to give voice to that silent sermon that surrounds us all the time.